Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench.
Hello, welcome back to the show. We're more than halfway through ANZAC month, and today we are joined by writer and historian Gavin Mortimer, whose book, The Special Unit, has just been published by Osprey Books. Gavin, welcome to the show. We're delighted to have you.
Pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Now, for the uninitiated among us, or if you're a first-time listener, you may not even have heard of Z Special Unit. I know I hadn't. I don't know much about them myself going into watching Attack Force Z, the movie that we're covering. Gavin, would you give us a brief rundown of what this unit were?
Yeah, it was predominantly Australian. I mean, they're quite well known in Australia. And there was a film about 30 years ago, Heroes, and it was Jason Donovan in it, actually.
Yes, it was, I think.
Fortunately, Kylie wasn't in it. So although they were mainly Australian, the inspiration was the Special Operations Executive in London. And initially, the officers were British, and even the officers in the field tended to be, certainly in the early days, predominantly British. And then as it expanded in the last 18 months of the war, as a mixture of Australian and British officers, the men were overwhelmingly Australian, and they worked actually very well together. I think it was a good balance. So Z Special Unit was raised in 1942, and it was by Special Operations Australia, so obviously the Australian branch of the SOE. Z Special Unit, they didn't actually refer to themselves as the Z Men, or it was just a cover name for a holding unit. It's very confusing. I won't confuse readers too much here, but they're also known as the Special Reconnaissance Department, and the Service Reconnaissance Department, and anyway, their first operation really was Operation Jaywick, which was when they damaged 6 Japanese ships in Singapore Harbour, and that was arguably one of the greatest special forces raid of the Second World War, even better than anything that the SAS, the SBS did. They set out from Western Australia in a converted trawler, the Crate, and then 6 men led by Ivan Lyon paddled into Singapore Harbour and placed limpet mines on the ships, and then they rendezvoused back with the Crate. And it was a phenomenal. Materially, it didn't damage the Japanese that much, but it was such a psychological blow that for the first time, the Japanese had thought that Singapore was impregnable, and here the enemy, they didn't actually know. One of the unfortunate repercussions was that the Japanese were so bemused as to who launched the attack, that they rounded up quite a few civilians and British and Chinese, and tortured them to death. But anyway, Z Special Unit then conducted scores of operations, some big, some small, in the against Japan in the last 2 years of the war. And the film is said to be loosely based on, I think, Operation Opossum, which was a raid undertaken on the island of Ternate, near between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, to rescue the Sultan of Ternate, wasn't it?
Yeah,
April 45. Yeah, but I think as we'll discuss later, the film is very loosely.
Oh yes, it's very, very loose, isn't it? So these chaps seem, they're braver than brave. These kind of men who do these sorts of missions. But the plot itself, the movie, it's a very simple plot. It's a 5-man team, as you said, are sent to this remote island to rescue a downed American aircrew and its important passenger. But you don't learn that initially. The movie throws you in to the start of the mission. And I'm on production this week. So as Gavin said, it was based on Operation Opossum. and it was originally titled The Z-Men, and it was meant to be directed by Phillip Noyce. But he clashed with the writers and was replaced before shooting was set to start with Tim Burstall, who directed many Australian films, including Kangaroo in 1987, where he won a Moscow Film Award. The screenplay was written by Roger Marshall. He was an English writer. He wrote scripts for many beloved TV series like The Avengers, The Sweeney, The Professionals. You know what kind of movie you're getting into when you look at the career of the person who wrote it. And the script was supposedly based off as well a pulp fiction novel called The Night of the Z-Men by Gene James in the 1960s. Have you heard of that one, Gavin? I couldn't find anything about it online. I'm sure it exists, but there's nothing online about it. And apparently torrential rain hampered the shooting, and the script was rewritten in to add John Waters at the last minute, which I think it was one of those, big production hell, this one, it seems. Filmed in Taiwan. Cinematography was by Hsiung Lin, a Taiwanese cinematographer who primarily worked in Taiwanese film, including a 1977 war film about a group of Chinese fighter aces in the Second Sino-Japanese War called Heroes of the Eastern Sky, which I thought sounded quite good. And this is a very Australian link here. So the music's by Eric Jupp, and he's probably best known for composing the theme song to Skippy the Kangaroo, which I thought was amazing.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's like, wow. And it was only released theatrically in Melbourne in June of 1982, where it took only 88,000 Australian dollars. But since then, it got a VHS release all around the world, and it became quite a cult film, I think. And it turned up on TV quite a lot in the 80s and 90s, especially in like the UK.
I remember it being on TV here in the UK quite a lot. I
yeah,
remember
it was.
as a kid.
That's right. Yeah, I remember seeing it on the TV. It was one of those sort of Saturday night movies, wasn't it?
It does feel that way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And Mel Gibson said later in the early 90s, he said the film was pretty woeful. It's so bad it's funny, which I thought was quite funny to add.
I think that's a bit unfair.
I think a little bit too. I think it's a bit
it's not quite that bad.
No. And we've got a review this week from 1991. I think it's for one of the VHS releases. And it's by Adrian Martin. And it has spoilers, just in case you've not seen the movie. Turn off now. So it says the film makes a laborious and somewhat suspect distinction between the nasty Japanese, cold-blooded, sniveling, robotic, and those stoic, dignified, mystical islanders who follow Chinese traditions. Thus, the film has a high dose of traditional gung-ho war film heroics, yet at the same time, it is also a film in the Gallipoli tradition about Aussie losers. Only Gibson gets out alive, and even the diplomat he presumes to have rescued turns out to be dead. A rapprochement and cooperation between Western and Oriental societies that is tragically cut short by the relentless atrocities of war.
That summarizes it quite well, actually.
I think so, yeah.
You can read a lot more into it. You can read quite a bit into this film because there's the elements of them having to convince the local islanders to actually assist them.
Yeah.
When the locals are doing a fairly decent job of resisting the Japanese on their own. I also got like a bit of an almost Vietnam vibe from it in places.
It did feel that way.
Vietnam War movie vibe.
I was quite interested to what struck me through the film was as you said, the Japanese. Have you ever noticed that in any war film from the Second World War with Japanese officers, they invariably shout? Yes. I mean, by the law of averages, there must have been a couple of mellow Japanese officers in the war, but in every film they just shout the whole time, and it's just so cliched. But what struck me was what was unusual, that the prominence given to the you referred to it there in the review, that sort of the stoic, the plucky Chinese. And in that respect, of course, it's good because the Chinese have been one of an earlier book I wrote about Merrill's Marauders, who were in the American Special Forces in Burma in '44, fought alongside the Chinese. And I spoke to several veterans who are very impressed by the Chinese army, but they haven't really got the recognition that they've deserved. So in that respect, I thought the film was good in shining a light on the Chinese and what they suffered at the hands of the Japanese throughout the war.
Yeah, I think it hints on it a little bit, where you've got the at the end, the villagers are talking about whether they should help or not, and they know the repercussions of that. I think it does try and touch on it. I know that's why the original Noyce, the original director, I know that's why he left the project, because I think he wanted to make something that said more about colonialism and more about, relations between the two countries. But as always, we asked for your one-word reviews, and this week it was a little bit, well, I mean, the consensus was there was a through line there. Ernest Malley said, one of all the Australian films you could have picked, you picked this one. I know it's not one-word reviews this week, but people were very adamant. Someone said classic. We had unfashionable, shotguns sounding like Winchester repeaters. Woody from World War II TV kid kitsch. Save the Clay Pigeon on Twitter said decent. But I think the through line there was that it's possibly not the best movie. I mean, it's probably not the best movie to pay homage to the heroics of Z's special unit. But I think for its flaws, I think the movie is enjoyable.
Yeah, I would say if I was giving it a one-word review, it would be OTT, which is 3 words condensed into one. Because I just found it OTT. So quite adorable, yeah. But OTT.
I think you're right. I think you might be onto something there.
So in terms of cast, we've got quite an interesting one. Obviously, Mel Gibson is the headline name that's associated with the film now, but we've also got Sam Neill in there as well, and John Philip Law. But it's a mixture of a cast. We've got Australians and we have quite a few Taiwanese actors as well, which is interesting because they provide the cast of the islanders and the locals, and also the Japanese, in fact. So we have John Philip Law, who plays Lieutenant Jan Vetch, who is a Dutch officer. So I'm assuming he's on secondment from the Dutch Indonesian army at that point in time. He was in 1966's The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming. And he actually played his other war movie headline title role would be 1971's Von Richthofen and Brown, where he played Von Richthofen, the Red Baron. Yeah.
Fair enough.
And then for the rest of his career, he had lots and lots of horror movie credits and TV work. Mel Gibson plays Captain PG, or Paul Kelly. And this is, I think, his 3rd film after TV roles and, of course, 1981's Gallipoli, which was the role that shot him to fame. 1990, we had Air America, set during the Vietnam War. 1995's Braveheart, which I suppose is a war movie.
It's a war film, I guess. Yeah, I'd say that.
Scottish accent is a bit of a war crime. And then we had 2000's The Patriot. Again, I suppose that's a war movie. And both of those films are hotly debated on historical accuracy. Let's put it that way. 2002, We Were Soldiers. And then, of course, in 2016, he directed Hacksaw Ridge, which was numerous Oscar nominated and won 2, I believe. But he didn't win for Best Picture or Director on that one. Sam Neill plays Sergeant Danny Costello. And of course, in 1990, he played Vasily in The Hunt for Red October. In 2001, he played Lieutenant Commander Charles Swede Momsen in the TV movie Submerged, which is a movie about a US submarine crew being rescued after they sink to the bottom. In 2005, he also narrated a Turkish documentary about Gallipoli. But interestingly, Neill wasn't in any of those 80s Australian war movies like Light Horseman or Gallipoli or any of those. This is his only 80s war movie credit, which is quite interesting, I thought. Then we got Chris Heywood, who plays able seaman Spara Bird, and he was Corporal Sharp in Breaker Morant in 1980. And he was John Leckie in The Pacific in 2010. John Waters, that you mentioned earlier, Rob, that came into the film a little bit later on. He plays Sub-Lieutenant Ted King, and he played Captain Alfred Taylor in Breaker Morant. And he was in the 1987 Nancy Wake TV series, which is about a New Zealand SOE agent. He was also Colonel Thomas Fiaschi in the 2014 series ANZAC Girls, about World War I Australian nurses on the Western Front, which I haven't seen, but sounds really interesting. I wouldn't mind finding that
good.
In terms of the Taiwanese cast members I mentioned, we had Chaun, who plays the rice farmer. And then we had Sylvia Chang, who is very well respected and has dozens of film roles and has directed and actually produced a number of films herself. And she plays the female lead in the film. She was actually in 1976 is the 800 Heroes, which is the Taiwanese film about the 800, which we covered a little while ago on the show.
Yeah.
I think we referenced it in the episode.
I think we did.
It's available online. It's a really interesting film. And she was also in another Taiwanese war movie that looks at the Sino-Japanese War called Victory. Then we had Chaun Hsiung, who plays Lin Shan Lang, who is the resistance leader, knife throwing resistance leader, and he was in a whole slew of those Taiwanese Sino-Japanese war movies as well, including Everlasting Glory. He was also in the 800 Heroes, so we got a nice little connection there. And in 1981, he was in the Battle of the Republic of China. And finally, the Japanese colonel was played by another Taiwanese actor who is very well known for playing roles in lots of kung fu movies. And he was, I can't remember the colonel's name. I'm not even sure he's actually named on screen. But the actor who played him was Yi Wan. And he was in lots of 70s martial arts movies like The Iron Man and Jewel of Karate and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a fairly small cast, and there's some supporting actors, but they're the main ones, and some interesting little connections with war movies and Taiwanese cinema, and also lots of Australian ones with Breaker Moran appearing a couple of times in there.
I think it's a good cast. It's nice to see Mel Gibson and Sam Neill like before they were big. So it's just nice to see him in early roles. You can see how like Mel Gibson, goes on to do what he does, because he's quite an action star in this. He's
quite
moments.
Physical in it, isn't he? There's little bits, especially at the end of the film, where he's run out of ammunition and he pulls a knife and he just runs and to outflank that machine gun position. And it's very reminiscent of sort of those scenes from Lethal Weapon 1 and 2, where he does an awful lot of running. It
is a bit.
People joke now about Tom Cruise doing a lot of running in films, but back in the 80s, early 90s, I think Mel Gibson had the edge on him.
It's much more, or Gibson is much more two-dimensional in this film than he is. And Gallipoli's a great film, and he gives a outstanding performance. And the character he plays, this sort of larrikin character who takes war as a bit of a joke, and then once they're in Gallipoli, you see how he changes. And there's that very powerful scene at the end when he's the runner and he just gets there a few seconds too late. And obviously that's to do with the script and the direction too. But in this, I agree, Matt. When you said it was a bit harsh, that Mel Gibson comment that it's so bad it's funny. It's not that bad, but it's
it lacks nuance though, doesn't it?
It lacks nuance. That's right. As we said at the beginning, it's one of those films that you can quite happily spend an hour and a half on Easter Monday watching, and then you get up and you don't give it any further thought. Yeah. But it is interesting to see, because they're filmed very close together. The improvement he made quite rapidly as an actor.
I think so.
I think Neill has more to do in this film than Gibson does, arguably. He's got a bit more of a darker character. He's the one who has to put the wounded soldier out of his misery. He's the one that has a little bit more nuance in that there's moments where he's very business minded. He's the one that volunteers to do things, but you can tell that there's some trepidation, and afterwards, he plays it that he's given it a little bit of thought.
Yeah.
And he's the only one in the whole movie that ever has more to say than sort of stop generic soldier lines, where they're having the conference upstairs, the villagers, whether they're going to help or not, help get them off the island. He's talking about, or Sam Neill's character starts talking about like them in relation to the people on the island, and he says it's all right for us, we wreak havoc and leave, but they've got to stay here and face the music. And that's the most nuanced line in the whole movie. And I just think it's interesting that Sam's character says that, and not Gibson's, even though Gibson's the one that's trying to do the convincing up top. I just think it's interesting. I don't peg Sam Neill for an action star. Perhaps he's in action films, but he's not like a rough and tumble action guy. So to see him do it is quite a nice change from what I'm used to seeing him in. And I think this movie is one of those movies where the test of time has made this one worth watching, just to see the early careers, I think.
Yeah, I agree. The only nuance that Gibson has within that character is there's some friction between him and Vitch, where it's supposedly Gibson's first mission leading them, and there's a little bit of friction of, you think I'm making a balls of this. I think one of the lines are after one of the ambushes, because they end up racking up a heavy body count, which I assume they
do.
really weren't intending to do. They keep having this terrible look where they run into Japanese patrols and have to shoot it out with them. And that's the kind of thing that happened on those missions. I would have thought, perhaps not at this kind of level, but I'm sure things went wrong. That kind of thing happened.
I have to say, I would disagree there, Matt. When you say they had terrible luck in running into Japanese patrols, one of the notes that I made, that these are supposed to be special forces, and there's a moment where they first meet our Chinese heroes in the hut, in their house, and one of them I think it is Vitch, who's outside, and 3 Japanese come marching down the track, and he not only fails to spot them, but he doesn't even hear them as they come striding down the. Now, really,
perhaps it isn't bad luck. Perhaps it's just bad drills.
Oh yeah, exactly. So, of course, that's for dramatic effect, etc. But I thought the film started well. The first 5 or 10 minutes, when you see them leaving the submarine, and that's very authentic, the submarine submerging, and maybe just float off and paddle hard to the shore. There's the music, and you see them pulling the canoes ashore, and you alluded to it a couple of minutes ago, that it would have been good to see the more tension between the characters. And that's what I was hoping for. Sort of, again, a note that I made was like a jungle where eagles dare. So they're on this mission. There's 6, there's half a dozen characters, and they've got to hack their way through steamy jungle, etc. But the fatal flaw was the Chinese element, because then it loses. And one thing that really annoyed me was the moment that early on in the film, when Sam Neill character, one of the men is wounded, and so Sam Neill gives him a cigarette, and they have a chat, and then he just shoots him. And that would never happen, and didn't happen. I imagine it would do to the morale of the rest of them. If you get a wound, you're going to be shot by your mate.
It's true.
But also, and late toward the end, we see the 2 Japanese soldiers discovering the canoes. Surely they should have left him there to guard the canoes, and he could easily have. He was wounded in the leg, so he could have canoed back out. But one thing they did have, from a historical point of view, there was one of the Z special unit. The men were all given a cyanide pill. And it was used by a couple of them on Operation Remau in 1944, when they were wounded and trapped on an island, and they knew the Japanese were coming, so they took a cyanide pill. So that would have happened. That you certainly wouldn't have. But then you see, so you have Sam Neill shooting him.
I did wonder about that. That was one of the things I wanted to actually ask.
Right. Yeah. So that's and in fact, just if I can digress momentarily,
of course,
on that Remo operation, one of the men who he was a British officer, Walter Chapman, who was there as he was an engineer, as a technical advisor. So he went and he dropped them off, and then he returned to pick them up. And of course, they weren't there; they'd been compromised. But 20 years after the war, in 1964. He had marital problems. He was in debt, and he killed himself with a cyanide pill. He kept from Z Special Units, and he took it in his car, and they had the cyanide pill. So that would have been that was just and that's, I mean, it does annoy me a little bit that when it's such a digression from the truth. To have them shooting each other, that it just wouldn't have happened.
And I find that interesting, because at the start they have this big preamble
I was
talking
about to
about
say that, yeah.
Z special unit, and it's like almost like it's been endorsed by like a regimental association or something. But then obviously when you start the mission and you think, well, hang on a minute, this is very Commando-esque book stuff. I know obviously these missions did happen. Look at the Sentinel's Air Raid. It is like Commando book stuff. But as you say there, it's just tiny little things that you could have easily added in. You could, say, well, you got your cyanide to take. It will leave you here, but if things go wrong, just take your cyanide. It's really easy just to leave out. But I think the issue with this is it had a bit of production hell, and I know that character that gets shot was only added in so they could have an American actor in to maybe help the production. But because he's not even a big name in 80s standards, it's another odd inclusion to me.
The other thing, of course, is if you're looking from a historical accuracy point of view, is that then 5 minutes later they shoot the farmer.
Yes.
And now again, the worst thing to do, because then you've set the whole island against you. The natives. I mean, I talk about not winning hearts and minds, and again, that just didn't happen. That you would not go around shooting the locals. On the contrary, the locals would be, most of the nearly every native population under the Japanese yoke in the Second World War loathed them because of the way they were treated, and so you would go there with your medical kit, and one of the most successful Z special unit operations was Semet, which is in Borneo, in March, really from March to September, and they did a fantastic job with the Borneo headhunters, the so-called wild men of Borneo, which they weren't, and they were very civilized culture, but that was what they were so good at, that they raised this guerrilla army, which rose up against the Japanese, and they did it by winning their hearts and minds, by treating all their little ailments, the nasty, the skin diseases, the dysentery, etc. And they certainly didn't go around killing them.
No, that is a good point. There's a lot this movie could have done to elevate it just a little bit more with some really simple things. I know they were rewriting the script on set, but whether they were doing the right rewrites or not, I think it's a bit obvious.
I looked into or tried to look into the association that's mentioned at the start of the film, and I couldn't really find anything solid on it. So no, I don't know.
That's a good point, Matt. Actually, there wasn't anything really, and they came up with this after the war, this Z special unit insignia, which is a dagger through a Z, but that was years later, and it wasn't like the long range desert group, the SAS, the Marauders, the Commandos. It was very nebulous, really, but because of what I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that it was very secretive, and that the men tended, unlike, it wasn't a regiment, so unlike the Special Air Service, you didn't have squadrons within the regiment and regiments within the brigade. So it was a lot of them never. They operated in small groups, and they never really met up. So yeah, I mean, I saw that at the beginning when it scrolls down which has been, as you said, an endorsement, but it's I'd never heard of a chap who'd endorsed it, and I think that's I wouldn't read too much into that endorsement.
Moving on, I think we should maybe talk about some of the kit we enjoyed. Talking about the negatives, let's talk about some positives. Moving on to the Alley Tally this week.
It's time for Alley Tally on Fighting on Film.
So, Gavin, you're our guest. As always, when we have a guest on, we like them to do their pick first. Was there anything in the movie kit-wise, or something that you could pick out that was quite historically accurate, or something you did enjoy?
They were using M3s. Yeah, M3s. I don't think they were particularly historically accurate. What did make me laugh was the camouflage one of them had. He appeared to be wearing a grass wig at one stage.
Yeah, tucked into a beret. Yeah,
that's right. Tucked into a beret. Yeah, which is an interesting
choice.
What
that is? Is the guy with the beard? Is that what?
Yeah, that's right.
He took some grass into his. Yeah, it was very odd.
I thought he just had really long hair.
No, he was. I think that was supposed to be camouflage, and it was.
Oh my gosh!
An early hippie. It was. Took me about 5 minutes to stop laughing.
It's like Wurzel Gummidge.
I didn't really have to say. I didn't really. Nothing struck me too much about the kit they were using. Just that they had a lot of ammunition, and because they killed so many people at the end, and but the real Z Special Unit chaps would not carry much. Obviously, most of it would come in torpedoes, these big containers that they would drop with air supply. So they would actually travel quite. They were quite lightly armed, but again, for the sake of this film, it was not that accurate. But no, it's yeah. I mean, it was okay.
Yeah.
Well, I quite liked one of the aspects I did like was the canoes at the beginning. They were probably the wrong canoes because it was definitely a post-war submarine that dropped them off. It was, I forget the name of the class, but it was definitely post-war. But I like the fact that they showed that and that the insertion, and everyone sees that and thinks Cockleshell Heroes, etc. But of course, it was used throughout the different theatres by SOE and OSS and various different organisations like the Z units. And I liked the way that was shot. I thought that was really nicely done.
Yeah.
As you say, the M3A1s were anachronistic, but they are so prominent in the film and they look good. But yeah, they wouldn't have been used as I think we said earlier. Owen guns or perhaps Stens would be more likely, or perhaps even Thompsons,
Austins.
Yeah, or an Austin. Yeah. But I did like the way they were. They had the jungle mags that were running, and you do see that in photographs, and everyone gets a 3-round burst, and it always hits the target.
They're like laser beam
falls into that trope, doesn't it?
Yeah, I like it.
No one uses their sight, but everyone hits the target. It's fine.
A lot of point shooting going on. It's very good.
Absolutely, definitely sent some assholes on those. The Japanese are all armed with Arisaka Type 99s, which is accurate. They also have Browning machine guns, which isn't accurate. But there's only a limit to what you can get hold of in Taiwan to film, I would imagine.
Yeah, I'd assume so.
At least they aren't as bad as the VHS covers that we've found where Mel Gibson's holding an Uzi or an M16.
Uzis. There's a French one where he's got an Uzi and a Jimpy, like he's John Rambo or something. It's very weird. We're sticking up on the socials. They're fabulous. One
of them he's been like they've superimposed Mel Gibson's head onto Arnold Schwarzenegger's body from the Predator, VHS.
I assume by that time he's gone on to bigger and better things.
Yeah.
So they're trying to just cash in on Mel Gibson being in this movie. But yeah,
what about you, Rob?
Yeah, I like that they all got silenced something. I know they're not the right ones, but at least they've got silenced something. They sound
probably
great.
would have had well rods and normal Stens, I would imagine, perhaps.
I mean, everyone loves the sound
or
of
Austin,
silence.
Owens rather.
A silencer in a film, it always sounds quite good. I like the chest rigs they had, but then again, that made me feel like the movie was like a Vietnam type movie. I'm not sure if those sort of chest rig bandoliers were very prominent in the Second World War. Maybe people.
It reminded me a bit of the Sten ones that the airborne forces had.
Yeah, they did look a bit like that. They look like a mock up for the movie, but they look good. They do look like special forces enough. I'm not even sure if the jungle greens they're wearing are the right
could be post-war
fatigues. Yeah, they looked a bit 60s perhaps. But the Japanese troops look quite good in their uniforms. I think there's something that I'm maybe going to write a little article on or something, because Japanese troops always seem to be quite well represented in movies, whereas when you see German troops, it's always sort of this early war blitzkrieg type German uniform with like the field grey uniform, and with Japanese you always get quite a good, even from the 60s onwards, I think you get quite a good representation of the uniform, and maybe because it just didn't change very much. I don't know. I have to do some more research. Case, yeah. But I thought it was good. And the chaps, the Mel Gibson and Sam Neill, were wearing the bigger 44 pattern Australian webbing pouches, which I quite liked because it showed at least they'd got some Aussie things in there, which was quite nice.
Sam had his slouch hat on. That was about the only other Australian nod, wasn't it?
He did. That was a nice touch. And some of the, I think the leader of the Chinese resistance, he has a Winchester shotgun at one point, doesn't he?
He does, yeah, like a Model 12 or something, yeah.
But for terms of weaponry and kit this week, it is quite sparse. But I think what it does have, it uses quite well, I think.
What I enjoyed, some of the death scenes. People died very well in the film. There was some great writhing around like a Premiership footballer going on by the Japanese, and Sam Neill at the end, he gets shot in the chest, and then takes him a few seconds to sort of slowly sink out of sight, and
very heroic deaths.
Yeah, exactly, heroic deaths. Yeah, and so that was. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I find that was probably, it was around about films like Break 'Em Around, which I'd forgotten about, which is a wonderful film, and Gallipoli, and around the early 80s, you had obviously the likes of Platoon, etc. later on that decade. But that's when I think war films began to, a greater realism crept in.
Yeah,
and you had the end of these, everyone being shot and rolling over very unrealistically, and that's what this sort of. I shouldn't
it's
be
like a last
smiling.
bastion, isn't it?
It's like exactly of a really. And there's Paul of what he said. Kitsch is a good way. If you're looking for a one-word description, I think that's pretty apt actually. Kitsch is how I'd describe it, but entertainingly kitsch.
I think so. Yeah, and we're talking about entertainment. Maybe we should move into our fave scenes and talk about the good points of the movie.
Hello there. Sorry to interrupt. I wanted to let you know that you can now join our supporting cast over on Patreon. As thanks for your support, you'll be able to help us pick films, submit questions for guests, have first pick on brand new and exclusive merch, and much more. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show. So Gavin, as the guest, you get to go first. What was your favourite scene within the film?
Well, I did like the opening scene, Matt. You mentioned it, and I mentioned it a few minutes ago, but I thought that was realistic, and I just thought that's
beautifully shot as well. I thought,
yeah, beautifully shot, exactly. The light just right, and coming onto the beach, and dragging, and the tension as they drag the canoe up, the two canoes up, because you think, you try and imagine what it must have been like when you land in enemy territory, and particularly against an enemy like the Japanese, where you know that if you're caught, the chances of you surviving the war were pretty slim. And so I thought that it built the tension very well and prepared you for a gritty film, and that's why I suppose you feel let down when it doesn't. It quickly.
It goes more B-movie.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. It loses that tension quite quickly, and it begins to contradict itself. Because one thing that I found very contradictory was the fact that you had 1 minute Sam Neill shooting his buddy, and then a few minutes later he's giving this very emotive monologue about the horrors of war and what they're doing. So he's a man, obviously, of some profundity, and yet he goes around shooting his mate. And so it was that change very quickly from shooting a farmer, shooting one of your buddies, to then wanting to help the locals, and isn't war terrible, etc. And I just found that. An hour and a half was too short for that, but other than that, so I mean the beginning and the end, the middle was pretty terrible, but the end scene was quite funny for the reasons we've just spoken about. That everyone was being killed, and there were some great deaths there, and it was just like you expect a sort of a late 70s, early 80s war film to be, that no one gets out alive.
That's me as well. Like, I gotta say, like, I do think it starts off quite interesting. You're like, oh, what's the mission? You're trying to work that out, and then when you do eventually find out what the mission is, there are some stakes there, I guess, because there's this guy wants to defect. He wants to help he wants to help the Allies' powers, like help bring the war to an end. So that's quite interesting. You think, well, how they're going to get out of this one, and then it does go very commando book at the end, very sort of cliche, having a massive shootout, and only Mel Gibson gets out. But I quite enjoy it for that. I like the sort of it, whether they meant to or not. unashamedly just really leans into some really cliche things. You got guys leaping over sandbags when they get killed, and Mel Gibson's throwing a burning cart of hay at a machine gun post. It's all very sort of valiant boys' own sort of scenes, and I really enjoyed it because of that. Like it's a sort of movie, I think, if I only recently saw it, but if I'd have seen this when I was little or had a video of it, I know I would have kept going back for it, for those sort of, you get your secret special raided type characters, whether it is historically accurate or not. But as a movie on its own, if you took Attack Force C off the title and you changed it with, like, you know, the raid or something very generic, it would be just as enjoyable. But I think I'm only enjoying it this week. I'm enjoying it for the wrong reasons, because I just like that it unashamedly just leans into all the cliched stuff, and it was quite enjoyable at the end. Proper beer and popcorn film.
Yeah, the end is almost reminiscent of like the Wild Geese in that everyone dies.
Yeah, it really
there's a big shootout, and then the man they're trying to get out ends up dying anyway.
Yeah.
So there's some real similarities there, although it's not as nuanced or good, let's say, as the Wild Geese. But yeah, I think for me, I think that end scene is one of the most fun, I suppose, is a weird way of describing a little set piece like that, but it works, and I don't know, it's hard to put your finger on why, other than it being a good bit of B movie action. So I just think it's really interesting that they managed to cram in so much into like 10 minutes. There's a little street battle which I thought was interesting, and the poor radio operator gets told to leave his radio behind and then is promptly shot where the radio would have been to save him. Now that's a cliche right there. There's a trope.
But he
that's
gets shot from behind cover.
Yeah,
from absolutely nowhere, unless there was a Japanese soldier parallel with them as he moved. I thought it was fantastic. You know, I love that. I loved it. I was sitting there just pointing out all the things that were sort of really cliched. But I think it's odd, because for a movie about Z Unit, and I know that we get Heroes, is it a CV series after, and that is quite serious, and
there's a couple. There was the Heroes, and then there was another series called Heroes 2, and that told a different story. And then there's The Highest Honor, which came out in '83, which was about the Jaywick raid.
That's it. And I think they're much more, they try and follow the actual beats a lot more. From what I've been reading into.
I think this film would have benefited more if they'd just done the straight Operation Opossum and gone in for the Sultan. I think that would have worked really well.
It would have worked, because they take so much from it.
No, I think that's the flaw that really brings it down, is the focusing on the Chinese and bringing that element into it, and it really detracts from the film. There is a moment that is quite interesting in the film, actually, which has a little bit of accuracy to Z Special Unit, and that is when the village elders are discussing whether to help with
that seems very good.
And that actually in it's the Zemet operation, which I mentioned earlier, which is in Borneo, the Advance Party, led by Tom Harrison, who was an upper class Englishman, an extraordinary character, but who had spent about a year living in Borneo as a Oxford student, I think, in 1932, and so knew the area and could speak a bit of a language, and had a great admiration for the Dayak people. But they parachuted in, and they went to a village, Ario, and the village elders actually had a discussion about what to do with these, I think there were 6 of them in total, white men who had just arrived by parachute. Because while they hated the Japanese, they knew that if they helped the white men, then they could bring the Japanese. They knew by then what the Japanese were like. If they wanted a quiet life, the easiest thing would be just to kill these white men and then dump their bodies to the pigs. But they decided, they had a chinwag, and they decided, no, we must help these people drive the Japanese from our island. And but that was, pretty tense moment. When there's some village elders discussing, and you don't know exactly what they're discussing, but you pick up you're having an intuition as to what's going on, and so in a sense that there was a little bit of parallel in that scene.
Yeah, I think, and that's one of the stronger scenes of the movie as well, because it does add a little bit of weight to things. You're not quite sure how things are going to go, because obviously, if you're watching this movie for the first time, you don't know it divulges into a huge shootout. It could become quite tense. I thought that's where the movie was going to go. I thought it'd be like a cat and mouse game of getting them off the island, maybe some subterfuge, maybe some sabotage to make the Japanese think they're in a certain area and they're not. I thought that's what the route they were going to go down, but no, it just turns into mindlessly shooting at each other for about 10 minutes, and then Mel Gibson's in a raft, and oh no, he didn't. None of his mates got out, and the mission was a bust anyway. So it's quite, it's still very cliche right up towards the end, but I still enjoyed it though. It's like, for all
one of you two may know the answer to this. Is it just before the shootout? There's the carnival, the village carnival, and they have the dancing dragons. Oh, that's in a Bond film, isn't it? I'm sure I've seen that in a. Oh, is it Moonraker?
That sounds familiar. Yeah, it might have been one of the 70s ones. Yeah,
yeah.
I'm not a huge Bond guy, but no, Matt might. Yeah, sounds familiar though.
I know what you mean. Yeah, there is because they're inside the dragon.
Yeah. Because it makes you think. In that scene's quite good. I did think they'd hidden the Z unit guys in the dragon, and then when it wasn't, that was quite a nice little touch. That was quite good.
Well, Lin was inside one of them, but no one else was, which was weird because he throws a knife and kills the evil Japanese colonel who has been torturing his daughter. That he doesn't know that yet. I don't think, because she only comes at the end.
He wouldn't have known that.
Yes,
no.
He wouldn't have known that. So that he's in there, and there's a couple of other guys, but none of the Z unit are in there, and the people on the stretcher aren't there. So why he does that, I don't know. But it's a good little moment of tension. It has to be said. And then the firecrackers go off, and all hell breaks loose. And it's next 10 minutes is just set piece shootout. On a low budget, but I think for a low budget movie, it does a set piece shootout fairly well, I thought.
Yeah, I think it's a shame because I still don't think the movie deserved. I mean, maybe it's only all the production team could get, but it didn't deserve just one screening in Melbourne in 1982.
Oh no, I think it had a more general Australian release. I just don't think it. I don't think it got picked up anywhere outside of Australia.
Okay.
And then I think it went straight to VHS video, and then it made its money that way. But I don't think I think it did get a bit more of a release than just the Melbourne.
I found it incredibly tough to find anything on it, like in newspaper archives and things like that. It was almost like it's been scrubbed. I
could be wrong, but I'm sure I read that somewhere. I think it was one of the Australian movie archive websites that said it had a national release, or maybe it was just within the state that Melbourne's in. I don't know.
That might be right.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So, I mean, I think have we done our final thoughts this week already?
What do you think? I think so. I think what we should do now is I think perhaps Gavin, give us a bit more of an idea of what the Z units did in that would have been film worthy, for instance, other than Jaywick and Ramu and those two that have been made into films. Because could it have been saved by introducing elements from actual missions, perhaps?
I think I've seen Heroes. I think there is a better film to be made about Jaywick because there was more tension between the crew members, and I think the whole Ivan Lyon was and Donald Davidson, his second in command, were both upper class Englishmen, and the relationship Davidson was greatly admired, and Lyon was respected and perhaps not quite held in the same affection, although that's not the job of a commanding officer. But I think then you've got the four Australians. But there's a better film to be made about Jaywick with some of the. I mean, a lot of the Z Special Unit operations that happened later on in Borneo and some of the islands around Indonesia wouldn't actually translate that well to film because they are much more about intelligence gathering and raising an espionage network with the natives, and also creating a guerrilla army to rise up against the Japanese in the latter stages of the war. And I'm just trying to think. I mean, there were a couple of operations, the name of which I forget for the moment, but where he actually died. Only about the last survivor. He was an Australian. He was a rugby league player, and he swam about 4 miles from one island to another to escape the Japanese. He was a sole survivor. He's not actually in my book because there were so many operations. I had to just select certain ones. But in Borneo, it's one of the very interesting aspects which we touched on earlier was the relationship with the locals. But they realised that the Japanese, the psychological impact of resurrecting headhunting, which the British in the colonial days had tried to phase out, and they brought that back to strike fear into the Japanese, and also the blowpipe. And the blowpipe, which was 8 feet long and very accurate over about 25 yards, pretty accurate over 50 yards. And they only killed about 80 Japanese with it, poison taken from the resin of a tree. And it would kill a pigeon stone dead, kill a monkey within about 5 minutes, and a man within about 15 minutes. And Tom Harrison, who was a leader of the Summit One party, said to see a man die from a poison dart is not pleasant. Paralysis takes over. And the Japanese were terrified of them. And they really didn't want to go into the interior of Borneo because they didn't want to lose their heads. Fascinating to research and write, but perhaps more like a Band of Brothers series rather than just a one-off film. But,
something more like an anthology, perhaps.
Yeah.
If you want to learn more about Z's special unit, I mean, please do pick up Gavin's book. It's available now. You can get it in all the usual places. We're running a giveaway, actually, for your book, Gavin. So
we are.
A couple of lucky listeners may be able to pick up a copy.
Thank you to Osprey, the publisher.
Yes, thank you very much.
We're gonna run that over on our social media, aren't we, Rob? We're going to run it on the Facebook and on the Twitter. Keep
a lookout for that one. And yeah, thanks for coming on, Gavin. It's been really
interesting.
It's been
good fun, and thank you for making me watch the film. Which no, I didn't mean that. It was enjoyable. It took me back to a time when I was used to watch Kelly's Heroes, The Dirty Dozen, all those. What's that one with Hannibal Brooks? Have you ever discussed that?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, that's one of my favorite ever, with the big elephant. Fantastic. So no, I enjoyed it, and and I'd love to come back on. If there's ever a long range desert group or SAS film, love to come back.
Absolutely.
We'll keep you in mind for that one. Excellent. Definitely. And thanks for listening again, everybody. Next week we should have Robert Lyman on for Kokoda. Keep up to date on the socials and we'll let you know there. As always, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Facebook, check out the website, fightingonfilm.com, and we'll catch you next week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, Gavin, and thanks everyone for listening. Bye.